Hello, I'm Lawrence Patias. I'm a memory distortion researcher at the University of Portsmouth, and this is a redo of my talk that I gave yesterday, which we didn't and couldn't record, at the Zoom and Psychology and Law Symposium. I aimed this talk at individuals who I envisioned in the audience of the symposium who understand already the history of the repressed memory wars, and also know the skeptical argument against repressed memory. So I'm not going to reiterate that, apart from to say that I want to say why the topic is important. So in the past, in some cases, digging for repressed memories in therapy, or going one step further and creating multiple personalities in therapy, which involves repressed memories often, has been sometimes a damaging iatrogenic type of treatment that has led to the split up of families, to suicides, and most important for the Conference on Psychology and Law, has resulted in costly legal cases with sometimes people being falsely accused, which is bad enough. Sometimes it's led to false imprisonments as well. And in other cases, it's led to very large financial settlements one way or another. And even today in 2020, I'm told by the British False Memory Society that there are still new cases coming up that involve legal action and legal defenses. I thought I might start out with a tribute to one of the authors that first got me into repressed memory skepticism and false memory research, Scott Lilienfeld, who wrote the book Science and Pseudoscience in Clinical Psychology. Now, what he said here, and of course, Scott sadly passed away recently in 2020. What he said was, in this quote, "One point we need to get across more clearly is what skepticism fundamentally is about. It's about epistemic humility, humility in our own knowledge." And that message that Scott embodied is so important as we go forward. We should not be certain about what is causing what in the most correlational world of the trauma's effect on memory. And we must be open-minded to the possibility that we might find that psychotherapists are more careful in avoiding false memories now compared to the past. Using this idea of humility, we can be open-minded to evidence that says repressed memories exhumation is still a sizable problem in society, or whether sometime in the future we might say that it has been somewhat solved or fully solved. And Scott also modeled intellectual humility by talking to, supporting, and listening to those who had some experience of pseudoscientific therapies, like Monica Pignotti or Sherry Storm and others. And he really talked to them as if they were equals, and indeed learned from them. We should be humble in a similar way and be open-minded to learn from others with first-hand experience or expertise in some of the problem areas that we're interested in, even if they don't have a PhD in psychology. So last time I talked to ZPLS, I talked about beliefs about dissociative amnesia among psychiatrists, and I think we have a fairly good convergent data that, at least half of individuals believe in the idea that traumatic experiences can be repressed, including we've done some work in an upcoming commentary with Henry Otgart and colleagues, and some previous work too. There seems to be a consensus of what we're finding, although we might find something different in the future. Let's not talk about repressed memory beliefs this time, because I did that a few months ago. Let's this time talk about other current challenges in areas of empiricism and rationalism that are needed to protect the public from some of the most unsupported extraordinary claims surrounding ideas of trauma and dissociation, dissociative amnesia and dissociative identity disorder, and the concept of repressed memories, which is a phrase that is not used much anymore. Now, one of the challenges we have is understanding the myriad of different theories and terminologies that use different terminologies, but obscure their central belief in repressed memories. Related to that is talking and learning from retractors who may know the terminology more than we have time to know, who, especially retractors in the last few years that have been through questionable therapies that do dig for repressed trauma. Another challenge that we face currently is the accuracy of measures or the preciseness of measuring trauma or dissociation, or indeed any other internal mental process that is involved in this area of repressed memories or terminology related to that. If they are not precise, what can we do about it? And another challenge I'll talk about in this talk is addressing other areas of empirical work that have been so important in helping understand the degree of plausibility of repressed memories. And that, of course, is experimental memory research that goes into memory mechanisms in experimental psychology. That's been so important in understanding what's going on in the past. In this regard, I'm going to talk about an area of memory distortion research that is especially important as therapists and legal practitioners have become more careful about full-blown false memories. So if therapists avoid full-blown false memories, what kind of memory distortions could happen? There are more subtle memory distortions that may operate in psychotherapies that are trauma-centric, but yet they're aware of false memories. Specifically memories of emotion and the malleability of memory of emotion. We also can talk about other challenges such as looking for converging evidence with other areas of science, especially strongly supported theories such as evolution. For example, does it make sense that repressed memories, dissociative amnesia, or dissociative identity disorder would have given our ancestors an evolutionary advantage such that those mechanisms could evolve? Is that plausible? And we can briefly talk about other challenges such as, the attention traps of social media that could lead people to believe in things that are not exactly true in psychology. We could think about university incentives can get in the way of some of the things we need to do to investigate this area. And we can also talk about detection criteria of rare events. So the idea that the more rare something becomes, the more sensitive we become in trying to detect it. And I'll talk about that, why that could be relevant. And then we'll return to where we started in the talk. So let's focus down on one of the areas I just mentioned. And the photo here in the caption is a fish and trying to catch a fish with your bare hands, which is very hard and it's slippery. Now, the analogy here is that therapies that may involve the recall of repressed memories or the attempted recall of repressed memories may change their terminology over time and thus be like a wet, slippery fish to catch and to pin down. To understand dissociative amnesia and repressed memories in legal context, you have to understand the myriad of theories and terminology that all predict or all lead to the possibility that you could try to recover repressed memories in those therapies. And of course, these theories could also lead to people believing that we should accept repressed memory testimony in court and that it should be allowed as evidence in court, with the potential, of course, to condemn a person to a prison sentence for historic abuse allegations that are decades old. Now, the challenge is that nowadays very few theories or theorists are very straightforward about using the terminology of repressed memories or even admitting that they believe in repressed memories. They do operate as if repressed memories are possible, even common, but most practitioners have moved away from the old terminology, and these days they talk about other terminology. Most commonly, the terminology is trauma and dissociation theory, although there are other ways to frame it too. This tends to be the terminology of the International Society of the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, the ISSTD, and the European Society for Trauma and Dissociation, the ESTD. their theorizing might sound something like this. Trauma leads to dissociation, and severe trauma leads to dissociative amnesia, which is a similar concept to repressed memories, although they don't say that. And very severe trauma can lead to dissociation that is so severe that it can lead to dissociative identity disorder. So we need skeptics in the field to learn this terminology and other terminologies. So if skeptics give up and pack up and focus on the old terminology and think that it's solved, these new terminologies can become popular, can become embedded into the peer-reviewed literature, and they can get included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the Mental Disorders, the DSM-5, and other important scientific books too. Now, my idea here is that is a kind of idea laundering. The ideas that the trauma can lead to dissociative identity disorder, and that people can be split away from their memories in different personalities, may have gotten into journals that are not very well vetted in trauma and dissociation. And as a result, I think of it as the ideas getting into peer-reviewed literature and then becoming knowledge when in fact they're not very well established knowledge. And that's what I mean by idea laundering. In some treatments, the terminology used to obscure repressed memories is engrams, or in others, it's unconscious psychological pain, or imprinting, or attachment, or, it could be one trial adverse learning. All sorts of terminologies are possible in dozens of books and dozens of websites, and dozens of theorists. What makes this especially confusing to newcomers is that these individual theorists will often debunk Freud before imitating Freud's early theory. The net results are the same. In some cases, you end up with false memories being produced in psychotherapy, which includes a whole bunch of different types of repressed memories that can happen in society, and indeed are happening in society. Such as past life memory recoveries in some cases, some extreme cases. Birth has even been remembered in some therapies. False memories of early childhood have been misremembered. And all of these some of these environments also create a kind of cultic environment in these psychotherapies that go along with the other problems of false memories and false accusations. And so we need to consult with people who understand this terminology, people like Retractors, who I'm going to talk about in the next slides. These theories can be like a foreign language that are obscuring something important, sometimes obscuring the idea of repressed memories. So other theories could include terminology about dissociative identity disorder. So they're not talking about repressed memories so much, but it's in there. It's in the theory somewhere. So they might be talking about parts, identities, personalities, alters, and you notice that they're not talking about repressed memories. So it takes some effort in the skeptic to dig down and not just search for the word repressed memories, because it's not going to be in there. It takes decoding and time to realize that these theories predict perhaps a necessity to recover traumas that are not known to the person at the moment. Other theorists might use different terminology, such as trauma-informed treatments. That sounds okay on the first look, but you have to dig down to find out whether that means that repressed trauma recovery is an option in that therapy. So one idea by Lucy Johnson, who's a theorist, a psychologist in the UK, is to talk about how formulation is a better way of categorizing people than diagnosis. And she criticizes biological model of psychiatry, which is a reasonable criticism, right? Some psychiatrists do indeed focus on biology and pharmaceuticals, especially to solve psychiatric problems. So there's a half-truth there. So you really have to dig down into these to see if it could involve repressed memories. You have to have your wits about you to look into the writings of theorists to see if they talk about the possibility of repressed memories, and indeed they do if you dig down into them. And this goes for any other theories that tend to overplay the importance of trauma. So they have a trauma-centric view, and there's very many different terminologies that they can use to do that, as the cause of psychopathology. And also it comes with the idea, especially dangerous if it comes with the idea that you have to revisit traumas. And, that can happen there's two theories that could lead you to, in this direction. One theory would be, we have to remember the traumas that we don't know about. That's one potentially iatrogenic approach. But the other theory would be, we need to re-feel the feelings again, and it's the emotions being released that's the cathartic aspect of recovering from these traumas, and that can also be problematic. And very subtly different theories there. And these theories also tend to underplay the importance of other factors, underplaying the fact that humans are very resilient to trauma and have recovery without therapy. And so these therapies can be obscuring the idea of repressed memories. Attachment therapies have yet another set of terminologies that can lead folks to dig for memories. That's something that we found correlate in our Patius and Pendergrass paper. We found quite a fairly high percentage of those in attachment therapies reporting that they had recovered memories that they were not aware of before therapy. Other trauma-centric therapies such as EMDR have their own terminology. Exposure therapy has its own terminology and could possibly involve trying to re-expose individuals to past traumas that they were not aware about that they existed, if the therapist really believes that you can get to memories that you're not currently aware of. And depending upon whether the client and the therapist agree that they should try to dig for unconscious memories. So the terminology and the practice in psychological therapies is a bit of a wild west. There are any number of different unsubstantiated theories out there that all permit or encourage repressed memory recovery. So we need translators for that terminology. We need to become translators ourselves. We need quite a lot of hours and days and weeks and years to become translators. And one way we could do it is we could value the input of retractors or regretful former therapists or individuals involved in legal cases like barristers who start to learn this terminology when we're too busy in academia to learn it. They could help us, and we could talk to them with humility to learn from them. So one of the ways forward here would be to identify therapies that involve a trauma-centric view, and to do a therapy-by-therapy analysis about whether their theory, even though they don't use the word repressed memories, do they model something that would endorse the recovery of traumas that people are not even aware that happened to them, or then they have not previously construed as being traumatic. And then those are the therapies that if you look further into, you may find some problems with memory distortions in psychotherapy, or at least harmful effects in some cases. One way forward to do this is by doing surveys and asking people to tell us about psychotherapies. One idea would be to create a website where people can report the name of the psychotherapy and the theory, get some information about what the theory is about the psychotherapy, and they can report how they lead to repressed memories, even though they don't use the terminology repressed memories. And of course, talking to retractors, as we will talk about here. So I've got two case studies from retractors who have been through therapies recently, of course, that don't use that old terminology. That's a link to that. But nevertheless, still end up recalling repressed memories and then being regretful or leading to problems or harm to the participants. So Retractor 1's story here is a case very recent, and it illustrates the harmfulness of repressed memory cases. That's why I'm starting with this one. So Kevin Felstead of the British False Memory Society told me about this one on a YouTube video that we did together that you can find online. And this case involves a woman who made an historic abuse allegation based on her purported repressed memories based on the therapy that she was in. She ended up in a psychiatric hospital, and she retracted her allegations. Once she realized that they were false memories, she learned from skepticism, from skeptics. Now, she became pregnant at one point, and that was a time when she really started to want to get her life together and to reject the idea that she had been abused, and she started to realize that they were false memories. And she told social workers that the original allegation came from false memories. Now, here's a problem. The social workers did not believe her retraction and didn't believe her that they were false allegations, so they retained their belief that abuse really had happened to the person. So when her baby was born, they took her baby away based on these past allegations. And after the baby was taken away, she took her own life in the psychiatric unit. Now, this study really, this story really underlines the need for dissemination that reaches social workers and therapists. Now, the important thing to point out here is it's quite a recent case. She passed away in 2016, just to illustrate how these problems are not just historically relevant. Now, this second story is a little bit different, and it underlies a different message. So this is the message that I got from this retractor just recently, in the past month. So it starts out saying, I am someone who experienced harmful therapy, and I escaped from it partly thanks to your research on the socio-cognitive model of DID and your research on false memories. I, of course, have not done much research on socio-cognitive model, but I did mention it in a video and elsewhere as well. Now, she goes on to say, last year I was convinced by a therapist and many other different factors that I had repressed memories of childhood sexual abuse, had multiple personalities, all of the craziness that comes with that. I got really sick from the bad therapy, and it was partly your research I was reading and your YouTube videos that helped me understand what happened to me when I decided to get away. So thank you very much. It was thanks to a lot of things that I was able to get away, but thank you for remaining a fierce advocate of skeptical thought and rationality. And here is her story in her words. In February 2019, I had an abortion after an unplanned pregnancy with my partner, and I started not to be able to work. I fell into a horrible depression. I think honestly, I had some sort of psychosis from the depression and how horrible it was. I was in heavy, heavy pain from the abortion every day, and I think she means physical pain there as well. And she goes on to say, we looked up some stuff online, which is an important thing we might mention later, and we found something called dissociative identity disorder. It seemed to explain everything. I already had a history of remembered abuse, and I was estranged already. So I joined a self-help Facebook group. There's a connection to social media. And she goes on to say, and I started talking to people in that Facebook group. They explained to me how I could find my alters, of course, those are other personalities in this theory, through safe space inner world work. So my partner and I did that. They, the DID self-help group on Facebook, told me that I had DID and I had to find a therapist who could treat me. So I started therapy with someone I found from the ISSTD. Again, notice that that's the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, also has a journal attached to it. And she goes on to say it was advertised by the psychologist as psychodynamic, insight-oriented hypnotherapy. Notice no terminology related to repressed memories. The idea is hidden in the terminology. She goes on to say, and it quickly delved into DID madness, dissociative identity disorder madness, and a hasty DID diagnosis, which she, the therapist, was 100% certain of, regardless of the fact that I've done no diagnosis schedules or tests. And so we started recovering memories. She, the therapist, would hypnotize me into a safe place and tell me to become different alters. In hypnosis, I watched horrible memories of being brutally raped by many men, being trafficked, etc. She told me to picture it on a screen, even if I didn't feel completely real. Any errant feelings that I had, she latched onto. If I was scared, we had to find the scared alter. If I was angry, we had to name and find that alter. They couldn't just be feelings, they were alters. She goes on to say, I told my therapist over and over that it all felt fake, like I thought maybe I'd been suggested to it. Before that horrible hypnosis, she had suggested to me that sexual abusers work in groups, so I could picture a group of them even if I doubted it. And she told me that, of course, I wasn't making it up, I was just in denial. I was not to mention my doubts to anyone else, or my alters would get angry and harm me. She goes on to say, I told her that I didn't want to continue. This didn't feel real. She told me that nobody else could help me. Doctors would just throw me aside. They wouldn't help me and would just put me on drugs, she said, the therapist said. The only people that could help me were, of course, her and her ISSTD colleagues. She got angry at me and told me not to challenge her anymore. She made me feel like an idiot for suggesting that therapy and the iatrogenic effects weren't real. She emphasized over and over that I was not to consult with other doctors. They were not to be trusted. Eventually, I was committed to a psych hospital for 2 days after I did some research and had a breakdown because I knew it had all been iatrogenic symptoms and the DID recovered memories weren't real. I'm now out of hospital in 2020. She says that she left that hospital in July 2020 and was there for 2 days. I'm doing much better now, thank you. I'm safe and sound. Now I am focused on spreading the word. And if you need any corroboration for this story, I have my hospital notes and my DID therapist notes. It's all in the files. And she did give me permission to use her story anonymously in this talk. So this awful case illustrates how much we can learn about shifting terminology from retractors, about how problems especially still exist in the present. So think about this. The therapy occurred in 2019 and the skepticism was learnt by this patient in 2020. And it also can help us identify what specific therapies are problematic, what specific organizations like the ISTD may be related or associated with some repressed memory recovery. And in this case, it was again the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. Now, another challenge that we face in this area of repressed memory skepticism, which is the old terminology, of course, the new terminology has taken over of trauma and dissociation, Another challenge that we have is imprecise measures in research that is published in peer-reviewed journals. And it's a problem in psychology whenever we deal with internal mental processes, especially when there's a lot of self-assessment involved in those measures. Specifically, let's think about how we measure trauma and dissociation. Are they measured in such a way to support pre-existing conclusions that we inherited from Sigmund Freud, from Pierre Janet, Charcot, and thinkers like this? And if so, if these measures are not very precise or not very single factor, if there's got too many factors that don't correlate highly enough, what can we do to address that? Now, the concept of trauma, first, is very broad. That's a problem. It can be a catch-all bin for everything that could be construed as causing a problem later in life. And therein is a circular theory, isn't it? So anything that causes a problem is a trauma. And as some of you may know, the internal reliability of trauma scales is very low. In fact, they don't really correlate. One type of trauma experience doesn't really correlate with another type of trauma experience. So we're not really talking about one single factor, one single entity. In fact, the correlations between subscales on trauma scales is so low that I didn't find that they were even mentioned in psychometric papers or just explained away, then not analyzed. So really scales such as the traumatic experiences scale, which is one of the scales that I have used, are a combination of very different and unrelated types of experiences that you would not otherwise be combining unless you had a previous conclusion that trauma is a single entity, and then that would make you combine them into a single scale. Dissociation, similarly, has similar problems. It's another very broad concept involving self-assessed memory errors, absorption, and feelings of depersonalization and derealization. All of these things, it's reasonable to measure them, but to combine them is not really justified given the level of correlation you find between these subscales. The correlation of 0.5 or 0.6 is not large enough to justify putting them together into one measure called dissociation. And all of these entities are very difficult to measure, even if you were to measure them separately, which I think we should. I think we should measure them separately and treat them as single factor constructs. But even though we should do that, they're very difficult to assess because they involve self-assessment in the person, and they're vulnerable to suggestion, they're vulnerable to being educated in trauma and dissociation theory. So you start to assess yourself as being traumatized and being dissociated because you've learned the theory, and then you answer the questions accordingly when you get the dissociation scale. So because it involves self-assessment, your belief system and your theory of how things work will affect how you answer questions on trauma and dissociation. Now, the challenge moving forward for more skeptical observers, skeptics of repressed memory, is to take the important ideas and that are impactful in society or in academia, especially trauma and dissociation theory. I think that's one of the dominant theories, and then to test them with more precise means. So if Bethany Brand or Constance Dallenberg argue that trauma causes dissociation in a long meta-analysis, there may be a focus on broad measures of trauma correlating with broad measures of dissociation, and we could investigate them more precisely with subcategories. For example, instead of measuring just trauma, we could precisely subdivide trauma into many different types, and not only do that, but also emphasize that analysis in our papers that we produce. So you don't just have it as a side note that these subscales correlate in certain ways with certain subscales of dissociation. You highlight that as a central part of your article, that look, this type of trauma correlates with memory errors, but this type of trauma only correlates with absorption. This type of trauma doesn't correlate with anything in dissociation and so on. And that might really undermine some of the prominent ideas in trauma and dissociation journals, especially the specialist journals. Now, I don't know if that skepticism would actually get into specialized journals that are published by the ISSTD. I think one of them is called Trauma and Dissociation, but it might get published in other different types of journals. So more precise measurement would lead to more falsifiable ideas and hypotheses. So you might come out with a hypothesis that sexual trauma specifically will correlate with dissociation or memory errors, and then you can test that, right? And it becomes, the measurement is still not ideal, but at least you get into the territory of testability, adjustment with evidence. So you find that or you don't find that, and then you adjust and look for other things. And then knowledge can grow much better with this precise measurement, which it probably goes on in some good areas of psychology already, and I'm probably not aware of some of the research. But with more precise measurement, you make more progress. So something that could be looked at as a way forward for skeptics is to take the time to read a journal such as Trauma and Dissociation, as painful as that may be, to find faults in the rationalism, of course, the causal linkage or the argument, to see if there's a break in logic in the argument, but also to test those same things that they tested in clinical populations that are very well educated in the theory of trauma dissociation, and testing them in populations that are not educated in trauma dissociation, but also having a precise approach to it where you look at one precise type of trauma and one precise type of subtrauma. For an example, this was from Patias and Lin 2017, just to show the benefits of breaking things down into smaller components, just basically because they don't correlate highly enough to be justified to be put together. So you see, when you try and follow up research on trauma and dissociation, you find problems such as here we found that sexual abuse composite on the traumatic experiences questionnaire did not correlate very highly with dissociation, not statistically significantly, and then you find other things that did, and then you can move forward in your knowledge gathering. Of course, you would need replication, and then you would need follow-up of, so here you find that body threat composite on the trauma scale does correlate with dissociation, and then you go one step further to say, well, what part of dissociation are we talking about? Are we talking about it correlating with memory errors or absorption? Or are we talking about depersonalization? And you might find a correlation, I'm just making it up, that the main relationship is between body threat composite and let's say depersonalization. So you might be able to fine tune the vague theory, which is kind of unfalsifiable, into a hypothesis that becomes more testable, such as we think that this type of body threat trauma, because it correlates with depersonalization, it could possibly be a cause, although there might be reverse causation, there might be third variables and so on. So this precision is the way forward to get away from vague, unfalsifiable theories. And of course, replication would be needed in this kind of research too. But I think you could go one step beyond what we did in Patias and Lin here, and be even more precise on the type of trauma than we are here, and also frame the way that you write the paper around the breakdown of the subcategories, rather than having a side note like we did in our paper. Okay, moving on to another challenge I'd like to talk to you about today, and that is how can we move forward experimental memory research? And that traditionally, of course, has been very important in understanding the plausibility of repressed memories, right? So experimental research is probably one of the most important factors in the past of investigating how plausible selective dissociative amnesia is, or dissociative identity disorder, and so on. The foundation of solid knowledge in cognitive psychology gives us a base to kind of ground us, so that when we have claims coming out of trauma and dissociation theory, we kind of can assess them against the more experimental work that ground us. We recently found that most modern therapies avoid the term repressed memories. I've said this before. And importantly, that most therapists in the public today seem to be aware, in surveys that we did before, of false memories. So something in our Patias and colleagues 2014, we found something like 95% of individuals were aware that false memories are possible. So this leads to a potential change in how memory distortions are manifesting in modern day therapy, right? So after the 1990s, after perhaps some false memories have started to be avoided in therapy. Whole false memories of entire events might be rarer now than they had before the great work of our predecessors at debunking repressed memories. While false memories are avoided in some therapies, other more subtle memory distortions may still be coming into effect there that people are less aware of. One such memory distortion that most therapists and legal professionals are probably not aware of, even some psychologists are not aware of it, is the malleability of memory of emotion. An example of this might be, just so that you know what we're talking about, you know, we might try and remember in a past event or in childhood how angry we were, or we might want to remember how distressed we were. And then trying to recall that is a memory of emotion. So how distressed were you during that event that happened, you know, so many years ago? When I say memory of emotion, it's the degree to which you remember an emotion. And the point being is that memory of emotion can change over time, according to this theory here. So the theory goes that your current appraisals that you have in your mind currently of a past event or a past person or just the environment. So your current appraisal of the environment, whether it be a past environment or not, is the major cause of current emotions, right? So how I view my environment right now is the perception, the cognition in accordance to what I feel my goals are, an assessment of how those goals are being helped or blocked determines an emotion. You know, so the example here could be that if you appraise, your current appraisal is that somebody is currently blocking you deliberately from your goal, and goals can be many different things, usually to our benefit, then you feel anger, right? So that's a certain type of appraisal. And notice that anger is the output here. If you then perceive that the person is not deliberately blocking you, then the rageful feeling that you had might change into a feeling of frustration rather than rage, right? So this is how the idea being that, you know, your cognitions are a major cause of your emotion. It makes rational sense, but it also makes empirical sense. So if you measure people's appraisals, they correlate very highly with current emotions. If you manipulate their appraisals, as you'll see on the next page, their current emotions change, right? But probably less known than that, that's a very important theory. The top theory we're talking about here is called the appraisal theory of emotion, or the cognitive appraisal theory of emotion. And there's theorists like Richard Lazarus that are quite famous for putting forward their very complicated theories, but I'm simplifying them here. It's an important theory for catharsis therapies that sometimes involve repressed memories, because in catharsis theory, emotion is the cause. It's a substance that is stored, right? In appraisal theory, emotion is an output, right? It's a very different way of thinking about the world. I think it's a more accurate way of thinking about the emotions too. So that's important to understand for repressed memory therapies. You know, some of them might frame their terminology as being emotions being blocked, and then you unblock those emotions. That's possible. But the second part of this theory, which is a separate theory, is that current appraisals will also be a causal factor, not a very big one, but a causal factor in memories of emotion, which means is that if your current appraisals change, not only will your emotions change in the present, but your memories of emotions will change as well. So the idea being that if you reappraise a past event, that could be a potential serious problem, because your memories of that, how you felt during that past event, will change in the direction of those appraisals. And we have done a little bit research on this. That bottom theory, by the way, I think was first introduced by Linda Levine in 1997, or maybe she could tell you that she got it from elsewhere, but that seems to be the case to me. So I wanted to present you some new research that I haven't published yet, where we did randomly assign people to different cognitive appraisal conditions. So in this case, the target person was the individual's mother who was answering the survey. And in one condition, we randomly assigned them to appraise their mother in an upward direction through some written tasks that we gave them. In another condition, we put them through a condition where they would appraise their mothers down just temporarily for the length of the experiment, and then we debrief them afterwards. And you can see relationships here with current emotion, the idea that our current appraisals, if they're changed, will lead to changes in current emotion. So you see a pattern here as you go from left to right on this graph, as appraisals are manipulated in the upward direction, and there's some control groups in the middle. You don't need to worry about the control groups. As you find that positive emotions tend to go up as appraisals go up, right? And if you move from left to right on the negative emotions on the bottom, you see that sadness and anger go down as appraisals of your mother go up. So these are current feelings of sadness and anger you feel right now towards your mother, right? So that shows what has been shown many times before, I believe, that appraisals cause changes in current emotions. But more importantly, for therapies that involve reappraising the past, we also found patterns in memories of emotion. So these measures are memories of anger on the bottom and memories of sadness that individuals felt during their childhood. I think, if I remember correctly, it's a composite scale of childhood, different memories of different times in childhood all put together. And you can see the pattern in these negative emotions. As you move towards the higher appraisal groups, memories of anger and sadness go down. I've put it another way, the more you reappraise your mother in a downward direction, the higher your memory of anger and sadness go up. You can see a trend there, and you can see the error bars are very large, but there is a trend. And you can see the opposite trend on positive emotions. So memory of interest in your mother during your childhood, or memories of happiness towards your mother in childhood, seem to go up the more you go from left to right, right? So as you move the appraisals towards an upward appraisal of mother in the present, remember you're reappraising people in the present, of course, your memories of your childhood seem to change subtly. You can see the size of these error bars, and you can see that this is a fairly small effect when you have one session in a lab or in an experiment online. You get these small effects. For many, many sessions that are more intense in psychotherapy, you might see bigger effects where memories of emotion really change, you know. So you could have somebody coming into therapy not really thinking they were just distressed during an event in childhood, coming out of many, many years of therapy, thinking that they were extremely distressed at an event in childhood or at a past event, something like that. And that possibly could end up in legal cases, right? So if you reappraise something as being very distressing, you might press charges later. This research here also involves the same experiment where we ask people, how much social support are you willing to give your mother currently? And those in the mother appraisal up group were more willing to give them social support. So this illustrates that these reappraisals may have consequences. Not only memory of emotions changing, but you could have decision making towards your parents. And we also found that the tendency to give social and financial support in 10 and 20 years was also higher in the mother appraisal up group than the mother appraisal down group. Just going to show that if a psychotherapy is prolonged and you don't get a reversal of these effects, we did find a reversal of these effects after 6 weeks, so also in our experiments, which we were happy to see. But there may be long-term effects if the reappraisal sticks in psychotherapy that tries to reappraise the childhood or the parent over years, right? So it might end up in estrangement. It might end up in legal cases, even in the absence of full-blown false memories. The manipulation of memories of emotions may cause problems. And there are other challenges that I just want to point out here. This is just me thinking creatively about what we can think about in this field. One potential challenge is to very clearly disseminate an argument of how plausible or not plausible it is that dissociative amnesia and dissociative identity disorder evolved, right? So a lot of writing has happened in the past about how memory is adaptive and so on, but I think we could kind of tweak it a little bit to be to this specific argument aimed at individuals who go through therapy, the lay public, people who would benefit from our help in understanding. They can think for themselves. Is it plausible that somebody with dissociative identity disorder would have that tendency to split away from trauma such that you don't even know what the other person is doing half of the time and what the other alters are doing? Would that evolve in our ancestors? Why would that splitting of not knowing what you've done recently evolve so that would lead to a group of humans having an evolutionary advantage because they have a higher frequency of their genes being reproduced, and those children growing up to full adulthood so that they can reproduce? So I think somebody could take the time to write that out as a tool to put out there for people to think about, especially people who might be vulnerable to getting involved in iatrogenic therapies and help them get out of iatrogenic therapies. So why would the unconsciousness of important traumas lead to higher reproduction rates? That is a question. So I'm doubtful. It feels implausible. I think there's a better step-by-step argument to be made for it that goes beyond what I'm saying just now. So rather than say it's implausible, what is the step-by-step logic of it? So for example, if it evolved in humans, how could that possibly help it become part of the genome? How could those humans that have it have the tendency to split away from traumas or forget traumas? Why would that give them an advantage in their children and so on? How could it lead to more children? How could it lead to more children getting to age 16 and so on? And then the second part of the question is, if the trauma dissociation proponents believe that, no, it didn't evolve in humans, it evolved in lower animals, in our primate ancestors, then you could put an argument together as how could it possibly have evolved in lower primates too, or lower animals before mammals even. All right, so just getting people to think about the plausibility of trauma and dissociation theory, or trauma and dissociative identity disorder theory, in whether there is converging evidence with very strong theories that is totally supported, like evolution, right? So the evolution of genes, change in gene frequency is a very established fact. Can we take that rock to examine dissociative identity disorder as an idea that could have evolved, as a disorder that could have evolved? And it would be interesting to hear responses to that, and I think some progress could be made. Another challenge is a new challenge in that social media create rabbit holes that could be a specific problem to repressed memory recovery and dissociative identity disorder taking off as a kind of a trend from social media. So you remember that earlier in one of the Retractors stories, they were talking about how they got involved in a subgroup on Facebook. So that's one problem, getting into a subgrouping on Facebook. And another problem on social media, such as Facebook, I believe, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube especially, is that according to this 2020 film, The Social Dilemma, which stars Tristan Thomas, and Tristan Thomas also talks about this theory about social media and the problems of social media. The problem happens like this. When you get a feed in social media, that is not just an unbiased chronological order of what people who you're following have recently posted. It's not that at all. It's a calculated presentation of recommendations of what the algorithm has calculated will keep you engaged the longest, right? So the goal of this algorithm in YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook is to keep engagement as long as possible. Now, in the case of dissociative identity disorder videos on YouTube, it works like this. You see one interesting video of a person switching, and that's, switching from personality to personality, and that's very interesting, right? And then that gets you caught in a rabbit hole if you don't understand that the recommendations on the right-hand side of YouTube will be all the most engaging videos that keep people for the longest amount of time and lead on to other videos in the same topic. So what happens is you only are going to get confirming videos that confirm the existence of dissociative identity disorder, and it's going to keep on popping up other videos that are also the most convincing about switching from one identity to the other. Now, think about it this way. If somebody were to put a video up there like I have done, debunking dissociative identity disorder, right? It's possible that it might get onto the feed, but it's probably not, because what is it going to do? It's going to stop engagement in dissociative identity disorder videos, right? So the algorithm is going to notice that it stops engagement with dissociative identity disorder videos, even if you're lucky enough to have somebody very entertaining give the video, to make the video, and I'm not the most entertaining person to do it, so maybe somebody else could do it. But even if the most great little video on dissociative identity disorder was to get put onto that debunks dissociative identity disorder, were to debunk, to get onto to YouTube, what would it do? What would the algorithm see in that? It would see that it stops engagement in other videos on dissociative identity disorder, right? So that video that debunks DID, even if it's entertaining, and I haven't yet put an entertaining one up there, informative, yes, but entertaining, no. that's going to get put down to the bottom of the recommendations. The videos that will be recommended are the ones that will create long engagement in the topic of dissociative identity disorder. To do that, they must maintain the theory, because as soon as you debunk the theory, nobody's interested in it because it's fake, right? So that is what can happen on YouTube, but it also happens in Facebook. I don't know how it works in Facebook exactly. They have recommendations, I guess, but they also have these groups that, you know, reinforce each other's beliefs. And it happens on Twitter too. When you're seeing a Twitter feed and you're getting into areas of dissociative identity disorder, it does not just show you the chronological postings of everybody you're following. It specifically uses an algorithm to put those most engaging tweets up there, you know, and in the case of dissociative identity disorder, that's those that maintain the belief, you know, such as a video talking, such as link to a video that carries on the belief in dissociative identity disorder. So to cut a long story short, this is how people click on the video on dissociative identity disorder because it looks interesting. And 4 weeks later, they come out of it completely with crazy ideas, you know, because of the hours of engagement in a rabbit hole trap on dissociative identity disorder. And of course, this happens in rabbit holes in politics on the left and the right. But this is something that you can tell people who have fallen down into those rabbit holes and are convinced they have dissociative identity disorder. You can say, look, this is what YouTube has been doing to you. It's been taking our attention and creating these attention traps. And it's been feeding us those things that are going to keep us in that attention trap. And after, you know, 30 hours of having the idea reinforced that dissociative identity disorder comes from childhood abuse and you don't know that you've been abused and all of the different theories, you become convinced because every single video has given the same message without any engagement in disconfirming evidence, because what would happen with disconfirming evidence? The engagement would stop. The algorithm sees that and it does not recommend those engagement stoppers, right? Now, this can be addressed if you let social media know. They can put a brake on problematic theories and stuff like that manually, but if the algorithm is left to go by itself, it will create these crazy idea pits, right? And so that's a current problem that we didn't have in the past. I think there's analogies to the past, such as self-help bookshelves used to have sections on repressed memories, and you could get into an attention trap on those because they're so interesting. And then after you've been in that attention trap for weeks of, or many books, then you start to think that you may have been abused when you didn't really think you were abused before. So that's one problem. One challenge ahead for us, which is a new challenge. Another challenge we have is that university incentives sometimes keep us boxed into doing a lot of empirical work that's already been done before, interpreting that, publishing that, and rewarding publications, which are, of course, important. And I think, you know, the peer-reviewed literature is probably one of the most important things why we started to doubt repressed memories, so it is important. But that university incentive scheme might, you know, not always encourage rationalism about developing ideas that might, you know, like in a popular book that not only develops academics' ideas, but also disseminates important information that could help people get away from iatrogenic therapies that involve repressed memories. Another challenge we have is understanding that some journals in academia, and this has been exposed in the humanities by James Lindsay, Peter Bogazian, and Helen Pluckrose. The same kind of idea that they have exposed in idea laundering in some humanities journals. It's a very specialized journals that, you know, reinforce each other's ideas. And the idea is that you get your idea into a journal and it becomes legitimized because it's in a peer-reviewed journal. So if the vetting of journals is very loose, or if you have editors agreeing with a strange idea, and then people in academia entering journal articles with that same bad idea, then these bad ideas can be laundered into what appear to be good ideas, but they're not really good ideas. I think that's true of some subsets of trauma and dissociation theory in journals like the Journal of Trauma and Dissociation that's published by the ISSTD, the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. So I think there's an idea laundering perhaps going on in those specialized trauma and dissociation journals. That's something that we could address two ways, looking for rational problems in some of those articles. This links back to the university incentives, right? Is there any incentive to read these badly thought out research articles? But we need somebody to sacrifice themselves to do it. So you can address the lack of logic in some of them. You know, it's like the leap of logic from dissociation to dissociative amnesia, for example. But you can also try to replicate those articles you find in trauma and dissociation, and also create subsets of more precise measurement, I should say, like I was saying earlier. So those are some of the things we can do to address idea laundering. Of course, that will not go down well with those people who have published that research, but somebody needs to take the time to do it. And they may end up agreeing with some of the articles, that's fine too, and have the courage to do it too, because it's not going to be without consequences to undo some of these ideas that have been embedded into peer-reviewed research and into the DSM as well. Another challenge that we could think about is taking the idea of this really amazing article by Lavari et al. In 2018. They're finding that when something becomes more rare in society or in our environment, we become more sensitive to trying to detect it, right? This theory of when something becomes rare, we become so sensitive when we try and detect it that we start to detect it when it's not even there, right? So this can be applied as a theory to repressed memory proponents, right? Who, when child abuse really did reduce in society, it became rarer and rarer. They started, their sensitivity at detecting it got very, very, very sensitive, so that false identifications of child abuse became prominent. So all the false memory problems of the 1980s, 90s, 2000s, and more recently could be because the problem has been almost, in terms of percentages, where very few people, children are hit anymore, very few people are involved in abuse anymore. And the sensitivity of the criterion shift down to sensitive may be producing just the same amount of diagnosis or recognitions of trauma, when in fact trauma is much less in society now than it used to be decades ago or centuries ago, and so on. So as things become rarer, criteria changes. But this idea that criteria changes could also be used by skeptics. You know, skeptics could think about this to think whether maybe we are prone to this too. So as repressed memory cases became more rarer, as false memory cases in psychotherapy became more rarer after the 1990s, we can ask ourselves, did our criteria shift so that we started seeing things that were not quite false memories and thinking of them as being false memories. So is it possible that that has become rarer, but we have not acknowledged that it has become rarer? And I don't know the answer to that, because every time I try and test these ideas, I do find some evidence that beliefs in repressed memories continues, and that the recall of recovered memories continues in the present. But we might think about our own confirmation bias, which is the last point, in combination with this idea that maybe our criteria are shifting. So maybe we could do follow-up work to be more careful to assess whether we're talking about repressed memories or we're talking about continuous memories that are being reappraised. And that's some of that work we've started to do. So I've done some of that work with Olivier Dodier in France, where we added on follow-up questions. And then we did indeed find that some cases were indeed repressed memories of abuse that people were not aware of before therapy, potentially iatrogenic, right? And then other cases seem to be more reappraisal of things, where the memory was there, but it was reappraised as being abusive. And that's very important, that we try and go against our own confirmation biases. Which brings me back to Scott's message, Scott Lilienfeld's message of having humility in our own knowledge. So if I could do that here as a final point, I would say my humility here is I do not know how common false memories are in psychotherapy. I just keep on trying to get an assessment of it, but I don't know. It could be very rare. It could be that it's a hidden problem, but maybe it's not a hidden problem. Maybe it's almost solved. And I think the only way to address this is to look for disconfirming evidence in all of us. And of course, not to be sure that we have a replacement theory. I think it's reasonable to be skeptical of a theory that makes extraordinary claims. That is fine. But I don't think we should be sure on our replacement theory. You know, we should have the same skepticism of our theories. Please leave any questions that you have. Email me any questions. That's fine too. Hope you found this interesting. There's much more to think about in this area. These was just some of my ideas, so please email me if you think I am wrong on some of these ideas, or if you have an insight about social media. That's something that I think we could try and solve to help the public avoid iatrogenic therapies that involve repressed memories. Anyway, thank you for listening, and bye for now.